The courtroom clock ticked loudly in the silence, each second marking time that Walter Grady had learned not to expect. He sat with his hands resting on his knees, the skin stretched tight across brittle knuckles, his body wrapped in layers more suitable for a winter street than a place of judgment. No one met his eyes. Not the clerk scanning files without reading. Not the bailiff stifling yawns. Not even his court-appointed defender, who seemed more preoccupied with the coffee stain on his tie than with the man beside him. The only movement came from the judge's chair, still empty, its wooden back rising high above the courtroom like a throne untouched. And then, the door opened. Judge Michael Carmichael returned with a deliberate slowness, his robe swaying with each step. But something had shifted. Gone was the hurried indifference of routine arraignments. He paused before sitting, one hand resting on the bench as he looked across the room, at the prosecutor, the clerks, the rows of tired faces, and finally, at Walter. He sat down heavily, the wood groaning faintly beneath him. A long silence followed. He opened the case file again, though he didn't need to. Every word in it now carried a different weight. "Mr. Grady," he said slowly, addressing Walter directly. The room fell still. "You've pleaded guilty to the theft of a loaf of bread. Is that correct?" Walter raised his head. His voice, when it came, was soft and unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor." The prosecutor cleared his throat, sensing an opportunity to speak. "Given the defendant's prior citations for trespassing and theft, and his status as a transient, we recommend." Judge Carmichael raised his hand. The prosecutor stopped. There was something in the judge's face, not just authority, but memory. Not just professionalism, but something more human. Something rare. "I'd like to share a story," the judge began, voice low but clear. 20 years ago, in Iraq, a convoy was ambushed near Fallujah. One of the trucks, hit by an RPG, caught fire. A young staff sergeant, Grady, climbed into the flames and drove that truck out of range before it exploded. His gaze flickered back to Walter. 17 soldiers lived because of that act. I know this story well, because I was there. I was the injured medic in the back of that burning truck. A sharp inhale rippled through the courtroom. A few heads turned. The clerk froze mid-typing. The prosecutor stood dumbfounded, his argument forgotten. "I never knew what became of the man who saved me," the judge continued, his voice growing steadier. "But I remember his face. I remember the sound of his voice shouting over G***fire. I remember his arms lifting me, carrying me through smoke and sand while the sky cracked open behind us." He looked directly at Walter, and this time, Walter met his gaze. "I am here," the judge said, "because of you." A murmur moved through the gallery. One of the bailiffs straightened reflexively, eyes locked on Walter. "For the last 15 years, you've lived in the margins. Not because you committed a crime, but because this country failed to keep its promise to you. You gave your service, your health, your wife, God rest her soul, and when you asked for help, you were given silence." He turned to the courtroom. "We've grown comfortable judging people like Mr. Grady by the worst moments of their lives. But we forget the best ones, the ones that shaped the lives we now take for granted." The judge reached for his gavel, but paused. "Let the record show, all charges against Walter Edward Grady are dismissed." He brought the gavel down once. "Court is adjourned." A stunned quiet fell over the room. Not even the judge moved. Walter remained seated, not from shock, but from something deeper, a fatigue that ran to the bones. His eyes flicked downward. His dog tags, dulled with time, peeked from beneath his collar, glinting just slightly as the overhead lights buzzed on. The public defender said nothing. He gathered his papers quickly, avoiding eye contact as he slipped from the room. Walter stood slowly, a deliberate effort, the knees long punished by concrete and cold. The creak of the old wooden bench beneath him was the only sound for several seconds. A young officer near the door gave a small, awkward nod. Walter didn't return it. Not from disrespect, but because there was nothing left to say. The journalists remained still. Not scribbling, not tweeting, not speaking. just watching. Something had shifted in the room, as if an invisible boundary had been crossed, between law and justice, between past and present, between anonymity and memory. Walter turned and walked to the exit. He did not look back. He had been seen. That was enough. Outside the courthouse, the city rolled on, sirens and engines and footsteps. But something small had been corrected inside those walls. Not in the newspapers, not in policy, but in one man's decision to remember another. To speak the truth that should never have been forgotten. And though Walter Grady still wore the same coat, still carried the same faded bag, still had nowhere to sleep that night, he walked taller than he had in years. Because for the first time in a very long time, someone had called him by name. And meant it. Outside the courthouse, the cold November wind pressed against Walter's thin coat like a reminder. The sky had gone pale and heavy, promising snow before sunset. He tightened the straps on his withered backpack, the frayed ends catching the breeze. His stomach ached with a quiet emptiness, but there was no bitterness in his steps. Just tired feet on cracked sidewalks. Just another day survived. He passed by a group of journalists gathered at the foot of the courthouse steps, their heads bent over screens, fingers tapping quickly. One woman in a red scarf looked up, as if to say something, then hesitated. Walter kept walking. He was used to attention that came too late. But by that evening, his name had spread like fire across the city. A young intern at Channel 7 had recognized Walter's story and uploaded a clip from the courtroom. It opened with the judge's declaration, then faded into a still image, Walter, thin and silent, rising from the bench as though from the dead. The video reached 100,000 views in an hour. Veterans groups reposted it with captions like "This is why we remember" and "He carried his nation, and we forgot." A photo circulated next, Walter from years ago, clean-shaven and sharp-eyed, medals on his chest and fire in his stance. By nightfall, local news stations ran headlines, "Homeless veteran saved judge's life 20 years ago, then faced jail for bread theft." The diner where he had once been refused service reposted the clip, this time with an apology pinned to the top of their page. A lawyer from Queens offered to take Walter's case pro bono. Donations began pouring into a crowdfunding page someone had set up without asking him. But Walter had no phone, no account, no address. He had disappeared into the city's alleys again, not running, just walking in the only direction he knew, forward. That night, a group of veterans met in the back room of the American Legion Hall. Some hadn't spoken in years. Others had never met. But word of Walter's story had drawn them together. "He's one of ours," a sergeant whispered. "He was a ghost for too long," someone else said. And so, the next morning, they came for him. Before dawn, 3 men in uniform stood outside the municipal shelter, where Walter had sometimes stopped for coffee and warmth. A counselor recognized them, pointed them toward the old storage room near the back, where Walter had slept the night before, curled against the wall like a man used to shrinking from space. They didn't wake him with words. Instead, they placed something on the floor beside his sleeping mat, a fresh pair of boots, polished and warm. Next to them, a new jacket, thick with lining and tagged with the emblem of the 82nd Airborne. Walter stirred slowly. His eyes opened, and he saw them. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. One of the men, a corporal with salt in his beard, saluted. Walter blinked, then nodded. That was enough. By mid-morning, the streets were buzzing. A press van parked outside Morelli's Market. A reporter stood with a microphone, reciting the story of the man who defused landmines and now walks the same streets ignored. Inside the shop, Mr. Morelli stood quietly behind the counter, his hand still on the register. He hadn't spoken to reporters. He had nothing to say that could make what he'd done disappear. Just before noon, a rusted van pulled into the town square. Inside were members of the 2nd Infantry Association, some wearing full dress uniforms, others carrying flags, one holding a folded frame. They asked for a podium, but there wasn't time. So they used the courthouse steps. The crowd was small at first. A few curious onlookers, a photographer, an elderly couple who had served coffee at the USO back in '89. Then more arrived, veterans in caps, young men in denim jackets, a school teacher with a civics class who had read about Walter that morning. They all waited. And then Walter walked into the square. He didn't mean to arrive as a guest of honor. He'd simply followed the noise. His new boots creaked softly. His jacket hung loose on his frame, the sleeves too long. But his eyes were clear. Someone in the crowd began to clap. The sound started slowly. Then more joined. Not loud, not theatrical. Just steady. Measured. Respectful. The veteran on the steps lifted the frame and spoke. "This is for Walter Edward Grady, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired. Who served his country with courage, who endured silence with dignity, and who reminded us that true strength does not demand recognition, but deserves it." He handed Walter a certificate, enclosed in glass. Inside, pressed between parchment and brass, were the words, "For valor, endurance, and honor beyond the call." Walter accepted it with both hands. He did not smile. He did not cry. But he stood taller. A young boy in the crowd asked, too loudly, "Is that the man from the video?" His mother hushed him. But Walter turned to the boy and nodded, once. Later that evening, a mural appeared on the wall beside the courthouse. It had been started weeks before, just another piece of community art, but now the artist worked late into the night. At its center, a figure walking alone, coat billowing, backpack slung low. Above him, a city skyline. Behind him, a shadow shaped like a soldier, helmet, rifle, flag. The artist didn't add a name. He didn't need to. People began to leave notes at the mural's base. Thank you cards. Small flags. A thermos of black coffee. One pair of worn boots, tied at the laces and left beneath the wall like an offering. The city council met in emergency session and unanimously passed a motion to name the square after Walter Grady. Starting next month, a new shelter would open just 2 blocks away, with a simple plaque at its entrance, "No one forgotten." Walter never returned to the courthouse. But sometimes, early in the morning, long before the sun reached the rooftops, someone would see him in the distance, walking the empty streets, hands in his pockets, his shadow long behind him. He always wore the jacket. Not because it was new, but because someone had remembered. Walter never liked crowds, not even before the war. Noise confused him. Praise embarrassed him. So when the invitations came, to TV interviews, to ceremonies, to speak at parades, he politely declined them all. The new boots he'd been given were still sturdy, but the jacket had big asterisk N to fade slightly at the collar from weather and wear. He walked the same quiet streets as before, though people noticed now. They nodded. Sometimes they saluted. He never returned to Morelli's. Not out of anger. Simply because that chapter had ended. A place that once offered shame had already given its lesson. Walter had never needed revenge. What he needed was silence, and perhaps a safe bench in the park on warmer days. He spent his afternoons at the Veteran Resource Center the city built in the space where the abandoned garage used to be. There, he helped younger vets fill out paperwork. He taught them how to navigate systems that often hid more doors than they opened. He showed them how to stay patient when the answers were slow. He spoke rarely, but when he did, they listened. One day, a boy walked into the center with his mother. He wore a school uniform, crooked tie, 2 large shoes. The mother spoke first. She said her son had written an essay about Walter for a school contest. "The Man Who Carried the Fire," it was called. He had drawn a picture too, a man with a pack on his back and medals in the sky above him, shining like stars. Walter didn't know what to say. So he signed the boy's drawing with a small WG and gave him a bottle cap he'd kept in his coat pocket, a simple token, meaningless to most, but the boy held it like a badge. Outside the center, the mural on the courthouse wall had grown. Each month, someone added to it, a hand resting on a shoulder, a backpack left on the ground, boots lined beside a door. There was no vandalism. No graffiti. Just layers of gratitude, painted softly in the corners. The story continued to ripple. Not in headlines anymore, but in habits. City buses added a free fare for veterans. The diner where Walter had once sat alone started leaving out a community plate. Anyone could contribute a meal, and anyone who needed it could take one. No questions asked. A new policy passed. Quietly, every public building in the borough would now include a small bronze plaque beside its main entrance. The wording was the same on each, in honor of those whose battles follow them home. Some people still didn't understand what had changed. But those who had seen him, the man in the jacket, with eyes like steel and sadness, understood. He had not asked for this. He had only asked for enough warmth to make it through another night. And in doing so, he reminded everyone how far silence can stretch, and how loud quiet dignity can become. Walter never moved into an apartment. He said the city already had too many walls. But he accepted a cot in the center's back room and used it on cold nights. When asked what he needed, he always gave the same answer: nothing. Maybe just some coffee. And so, each morning, one of the volunteers made sure a thermos sat by the door, filled and ready. Years passed. Faces changed. But the square named for Walter Grady became a place of routine respect. Children on school trips paused at the mural. Soldiers touched their hats as they passed. Each Memorial Day, someone left a single loaf of bread on the bench near the wall, wrapped in cloth, tied with string, and labeled simply, "For strength." No one said who started the tradition. No one had to. When Walter passed, he left behind no will, no family records, no possessions beyond the jacket, the boots, and the folded certificate still in its original glass frame. The city arranged a small service. No speeches. No photos. Just a closed casket draped in a flag, and a chair set aside beside it, for anyone who had once sat alone. The crowd that gathered surprised even the mayor. Veterans from every borough. Teachers. Journalists. A boy now older, holding the same drawing, now laminated and worn. Even Mr. Morelli stood in the back, hat in hand, eyes fixed on the floor. A retired army captain stepped forward and placed a small velvet box on the casket. Inside was a medal, a replacement bronze star, engraved with Walter's name. It had taken months to obtain. No one knew if he would have accepted it. But it was his. The ceremony ended not with applause, but with stillness. A long, full silence that stretched through the trees like a held breath. Then, the gentle tap of boots on stone. One by one, those who came walked past the casket. No words. Just a touch. A pause. A memory. Later that week, the city installed a final plaque in the square. It bore no image. Just words, chiseled deep. Walter Grady walked unseen, yet carried a nation's weight. He asked for nothing. He left behind everything. Below that, in smaller print: kindness without question is enough.